So Jay, let's kick it off with this question. The world is currently not being cared for, and you might have a lot of opinions about whether it can be cared for,
Yep.
but it's definitely not being cared for, and that's important for some reason.
Yep.
Uh, could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I have a lot of things to say about it, but we could start with just this one little version of it. So like the world, or my world or your world, is not the planet or the environment. Those things are like, Mark will appreciate, or at least back me up on this. Like the planet doesn't give a fuck about us, or maybe it kind of gives a fuck about us, but it doesn't. Over the long term, it's not. Like we are a minor inconvenience in the millennia of existence of the planet. Yeah, um, even if it recognizes us in any way. But the point being, the world that we're talking about is not some sort of thing other than us. What I would mean, or what I would want to mean by a world, is the way in which we kind of assemble things around us that we interact with, um, and the way and the things in that world, um, or the world is made up of a set of things that we need in order to exist. And need maybe is a weird word for that, but like we kind of like when I think of my office, like I have arranged my office in a way where things have a place. So when I want to find them, I can go find them, and when I want to put them away, I can put them away. And so like kind of this finding and putting away and structuring of the office is a form of caring for the office. It's a form of taking care of a world space that I kind of exist in, right? And we talked a little bit in the past about kind of like embedded cognition. So there's this idea that like I don't think just in my head. I think with the environment that I'm in. So in the way in which I can care for my office, I'm also caring for how I think or how I exist. There's different ways to kind of say that. So there's kind of like an idea here that says that there's a way in which the world can be structured that can be cared for, and there's a way in which the structuring of the world makes it harder to care for it. So it makes it harder to figure out where things belong or how things work together. So one of the things about this kind of world idea is it's like a system, or holism. So the parts are important, but they're only important because there are other parts related to it, right? So like a hammer is only important. I only have concern for a hammer if I have nails and wood and I want to do something with it. Otherwise, it doesn't. It's not part of my world. It's just kind of an object, right? So like it's like a rock. Is one way of thinking of it. So that's a really quick version of caring, but like the opposite is also useful to kind of point at, and maybe why the world isn't right now for so many people something they can care for, like that they don't find the world in a way that they can care for the world. Um, and I like to call it managerialism. And what I mean by managerialism is when we reduce all of the relationships that I'm talking about, pointing at, to kind of numerical relationships, mathematize the world, um, in an attempt to manage the world at kind of like I don't have to be actively engaged in the concern because the math is going to take care of my concern. And therefore, I kind of reduce the world to a set of numbers. Um, and that's very hard to care for. It's easy to manage, but managing something is different than caring for it, is in one way of thinking about it.
So, like, am I thinking about the number of barrels of oil I can extract
Yes.
into
Yeah.
the market?
Yep. And in particular, I mean, the oil market right now is really super interesting for this. So like, how is it that a barrel can be worth negative $30? Well, it's because what you're actually managing is, what Heidegger would call the standing reserve. So it's the idea that you don't think of a barrel of oil as a barrel of oil, but a unit of reserved energy, right? And in the particular case of negative $30 a barrel of oil, the problem is that we have poorly managed, in this particular case, the production or the extraction of a standing reserve so that we have more out of the reserve than it should be. And therefore, the result of that is we have no place to store the excess. So we've created an excess glut of oil, and we don't have anywhere to put it. So people will pay you to take it from them because they literally don't have anywhere to put it. And it would be more expensive for them to receive the oil and have nowhere to put it than to pay you to take it away from them, which I think is super interesting. But this idea of managerialism is, to me, super interesting in that, like, managerialism is like, I do what I spend most of my life doing is helping people manage like big clusters of servers. And so, the idea of kind of mathematizing the world is that in the same way we could manage our servers perfectly and without fault or issue, we should be able to manage the whole planet that way, right? And if you didn't kind of like stop at the part where I was like, we can manage the bunch of servers, well, that's the problem, is that like this theory that we can kind of reduce large systemic relationships to mathematical formulas at a global level, so at a planetary level, is an utter illusion and an arrogance that is ridiculous. And so the result of that is that that arrogance resulted in kind of globalism and blah blah blah. A lot of different kind of economic frameworks that we all live under right now that don't have a hope in the world of managing the globe. And at the same time, they've reduced our ability to care for the world. And there's this weird reflexive thing that happens too that I like to point out. I often say, like, one of the ways to think about like the mathematization of the world is to think of it like a painting. So one of the ways painting works is that, like, when you look at a painting, you especially imagine a landscape, for instance. You're standing in front of the painting, and the reason why it's a good landscape is because you can imagine yourself in the landscape. You can imagine yourself in the picture, or in relation to the picture, that you can imagine that the picture is what I just earlier described as a world that you could be part of, right? So you can imagine, you can see yourself in there. You can have concern for, yeah. So one of the things that in managerialism, and one of the things in kind of numeracy of the world, is that the painting is made of numbers. And so you have to imagine, to some extent, the reflexive moment at that point is, if I would like to see myself in this world of numbers, what do I have to make myself into in order to be part of that world? And all of a sudden, it's not just the reduction of the world into numeracy, it's the reduction of oneself into a numerical system, yeah? And so this is like part of the interesting part of the worldingness, is that the mental frame that you apply to a world, it doesn't apply to some sort of objective out there thing. It applies to your existence in it. And therefore, like, part of what's happening, in these kind of numerical managerial systems is like the idea of self-discipline, self-management, quantification, self-quantification. All of these ideas are about reducing your experience in the world to that one frame that allows you to see yourself in that kind of way of thinking about the world. And I'll just say one last thing, and then I'll let Mark or somebody else talk because I've been talking for a while. But the other way to kind of like critique this, the other way to kind of talk about this mathematization and this problem is to say that if you reduce yourself that way, you have a less rich experience of the world. You have a less rich way of being in the world. And I want to be really careful here because I'm not saying that the mathematics don't reveal a truth about the world. They don't. They do. They do reveal truthful relationships, repetitive relationships, science and mathematization. These reveal a truth about the world that is absolutely true. But that revelation, that mathematical revelation, has a tendency to hide other forms of truth. And you know, forms of truth where I mean like ways of being, ways of relating to the world that are truthful, that are authentic, however you want to say that word. But the point being that the thing that science likes to point at, the things that math likes to point at, which is kind of the ridiculous level of efficacy of the scientific method, that very ridiculous level of efficacy is the thing that hides other ways of being. And it reduces the world to scientific and mathematical understandings and eliminates other understandings or hides them from us. And that's one of the things we need to worry about, I think.
So Jabe has kind of outlined this space of holism and managerialism coming from this question of, you know, can we care for the world? Should we care for the world as well? Mark, should we care for the world? How can we care for the world in your view of things?
Okay, so I'll follow maybe almost Jabe's train of thought, but just take it slightly different. So Jabe, I agree with Jabe, opening statement, the world doesn't care about us. So I'll go refine it too and differentiate it. The world, in a sense, evolution has found it usually beneficial to get rid of most of the species that ever existed in favor of further evolved species. So having an expectation that we're going to be around forever, in a sense, is not realistic at all. But I don't think that, so in the thought when we're saying the world doesn't care about us, we already make a differentiation between us and the world, yeah? And I think part of what Jade was actually trying to explain is that's fake, yeah? So there is something about human thought when we started to realize we're maybe the only species that reflects on life, the world, why we're here, all of that. There is a difference, and a lot of, I think, philosophy, theology, well, is about exploring that difference. So what makes us different? And that has strongly influenced how we build material, how we build tools, etc. Because we can look at other human societies, cultures that didn't have this strong difference, didn't have the need for differentiating themselves from the world. They still do tools and stuff, but they're thinking about sustainability of all of these things. They're taking up a more embedded view of themselves in the world, yeah? And so the question then, I mean, since I'm a teenager, this is a question that has been around in intellectualism. So why can't we be more caring or more thinking about sustainability and all of this? So one of the things that I started to believe quite a while ago is that, so since I am actually seeing humans or humanity or culture and societies as part of evolution, it literally, we do have there is meaning within evolution why we're here. So it's not true to say the world doesn't care about us. What I would say is that evolution is dispositioned in a way that we are still a safe to fail experiment for life. Yeah, so there's enough organismity out there that will survive whatever we throw at it, nuclear, chemical, blah, blah. Life has coped with very bad environments before and persevered. Yeah. So just to give you a provocative thought, yeah, I'm not entirely serious, but I'm not entirely joking about it either. From an evolutionary point of view, one of the things we're doing really successfully is we're spreading plastics throughout the world. Yeah. Maybe in, give it some 100 million years, nature will develop new metabolisms based on plastics being part of molecules and blah, blah, blah. So for example, when the blue algae came around, it increased the oxygen in the atmosphere. And the consequence of that was that because there was more breathable oxygen around, organisms with a higher metabolism could evolve. So it literally accelerated options, or it widened the pool of options for organisms. And the higher metabolic organisms were the ones that were largely successful. Maybe what we do with plastic will allow an equal increase of metabolism in some shape or form that I can't think through. I'm not a biochemist, or not enough to really think how that might work. Maybe somebody in the audience could maybe do something. But it's just an idea. Why are we here? Yeah, we're somewhere in the chain of evolution, and where that chain is leading to is another thing that we have no idea and can't figure out. This is completely removed from our perception. So I often explain this like a brain cell has no idea of the reflective thought that we have about the world. Yeah, it is not aware of it. It doesn't care about it. It deals with much smaller, granular, finer granularity of things. Equally, so thinking about what trajectory evolution has or what purpose, etc., is something maybe a really well-connected big society maybe one day start to get to grasp it. Well, right now we have. I haven't read anything, and I'm reading this kind of stuff that sounds like likely to be in the right direction. So the world does care about us to the extent that we're a safe to fail experiment in furthering evolution. I thought when you made the little thing about oil, so the way I see it and I talk about it is this is basically now a multi-perspective regime biting back.
Yeah.
Because it's not that people actually believe, yeah, we're really going to stop using oil in masses from now on, even though I think that might be an interesting thought, given that that is one of the goals we're trying to achieve, or should try to achieve, if we want to get, if we want to slow down climate change. It reminded me about stuff that I've seen in companies with continuous deployment. So in a way, the way that the oil issue now has come about is literally that we created this huge pipeline, yeah, that was constantly pumping oil from sources to everybody who wanted to consume it. And we can't just switch it off, yeah. And equally, I've seen in companies got very good technically at creating continuous deployment, continuous delivery pipelines, but we're far slower at figuring out worthy things to deliver, yeah?
100%.
And then the guy
100%.
comes and says, hey, I'm spending here $500,000 in my quarter on maintaining this pipeline. Give me stuff that I can show we're producing, and you stop caring. It's just, yeah, cheap. It's almost cheaper just to give you the thing to try, yeah? And we run experiments with full production code, fully tested, fully secure, blah, 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 that nobody wants, yeah? Or we don't know whether anybody. And it's almost that's the same economic absurdity, yeah. With the oil, it's we never thought. So when we think about these complex systems that we're creating, we never think, or we never actually want to take into consideration the cost of what if it doesn't go as well as we wish it will, yeah. So you hear all these governments talking right now. This is totally anticipated. Nobody could. I read stuff in the 80s that described exactly what happens now. So people were fully aware. So viral infection, what would we do? In the 80s papers, we will tell people to stay at home. That's the only way to stop the spread. We will stop international travel. Borders will be closed. And I think that's going to be one of the impacts that I'm going to be sad about, that I expect as a consequence of this, international travel, the way we're used to it, might become, again, a very rare thing, if not impossible, yeah? Depending on is there any form of how can you prove that you have immunity and you can't be a transmitter and blah? We don't know yet whether any of that is possible. If none of it is possible, or if nothing happens, we're going to at least going to have a very long road to opening up borders again, and that will require that we all have the same health regimes, etc. So, given we had economic drivers to try harmonize, and still took 7 years to do a trade deal, and blah blah blah. So, where lots of money interests are there driving, how long will it take when health is the only reason we're doing it? No fiscal interests that actually profit from having it. So the way to think about caring about the world is literally just caring about ourselves. So we're totally on track to make the world inhospitable to ourselves. And Jane knows I have a little theory that might actually be the trajectory evolution wants us to take, because so life sort of tries to expand in territory. Yeah, so in some way, we need to get off this planet, yeah? And right now, I would say we might be the best chance of life getting off this planet. But we haven't figured out how to live off planet yet. And partially what I see us doing is actually learning to live in more and more and more artificial environments. And the motivation to perfect this to the extent that we could learn how to live in space is making this planet inhospitable. That's almost the best experiment. We tried biodomes and all of these, and because there's no real survival pressure, we're not willing to risk lives to figure this stuff out. We actually haven't figured it out. But if we destroy the planet, then people will die, and that will create a different impetus into trying things. And yeah, we will probably go. I have said this for a while now, climate change. I'm pretty sure sooner or later they're going to go and fuck with the atmosphere, going to go and try chemical shit, and, geoengineering. And given how poorly we understand complexity, my expectation is it will just make things worse, possibly by magnitude of things. So it's not a terribly positive, optimistic, well, it depends how you look at it. As a futurist who always imagined that life in space is so much more exciting than on Earth when I was young, and I'm changing my mind about that now, getting older and appreciating outdoors. Maybe you see this as a positive thing. But in a sense, we need to start caring about the world if we want to care for enjoying this world.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, at one point, the world will become inhospitable to us. So the only way for us to live here is in complete enclosures. And then evolution will just continue, whether we're here or not. We're no longer part of it, or some weird experiment in a petri dish or so. So the reason to care for the world is, if you want to have an outdoors life, you should start caring.
What I heard there was kind of like the unwillingness to separate ourselves from the world and to instead incorporate ourselves or our understanding, the way that we're framing all this, as being part of the world. And so in caring for the world, we are caring for ourselves, and sort of accordingly, in not caring for the world, we are not caring for ourselves and making the world inhospitable to us. Now, I kind of want to come back to at some point this notion of the ultimate burning platform, just burn the whole world down. You almost sounded hopeful in that, but I want to come back to that, and I kind of want to create a space around something that I've heard Jabe talk about before with both the futures cone, and then also this idea of widening futures and closing off futures. And basically this idea of what is happening now, and the way that we're interacting with the world. Are we creating more futures where we continue to exist, or creating fewer futures where we continue to exist? And Jabe, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of the basics behind the futures cone as well as the widening bit.
Sure. So futures cone is an idea from a set of futurists. I will not remember their names right now, but I can send you a link and we can put that in the description of the video. And it basically says that if you can imagine yourself kind of holding a flashlight that has kind of like bands of intensity, right? So like the center is very bright, and then it gets there's another band, and it gets very kind of dim towards the edges. The idea is that as you're looking into the future, you're pointing the flashlight into the future, right? And in the center, the thing that's the narrowest, brightest part of the beam is what is probable. So it's kind of like, if we use management theory and science and probabilistic theory and probabilistic forecasting, blah, 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 what we will get is this is what's likely to happen. This is what we can expect. If we do not intervene in the chain of events and we keep reproducing the behaviors and systems that we've behaved in the past, this is what we can expect to probably happen, right? And so a lot of climate theory, a lot of climate scientists are doing what's probable, right? Like if we don't do anything, this is the temperature will rise by 2.5 degrees, probably, right? So that's what probably will happen. Now, those same papers, if you read them, they will say, here is what could plausibly happen. What they mean by plausibly is we can imagine that the range of temperature would be significantly greater than 2%, and 2 points, but maybe as low as 1.5 points. Like this is what is imaginable. This is what we can imagine happening. So it's not likely to happen if we don't do anything about it, but we could do things and plausibly shift the range of the future temperature of the planet by this much. So that's the plausible around. Then, so within that area, right, there's this idea of what's probable and what's plausible, and then what is preferable. So what's preferable is like trying to shift what is probably going to happen and shift it to what we would prefer to happen, right? But around plausible is what is possible. And one of the interesting things about possible is that possible isn't necessarily plausible. So what I mean by that is that we may not be able to conceive of, imagine, understand what might happen, but it still might happen, right? So like, 6 months ago, despite what Mark said about people knowing what would happen if there was a disease, what is happening, most people would consider not to have been plausible in their understanding of the world, right? So yes, epidemiologists thought it was plausible. Yes, other people. Most people did not consider shutting down the entire global economy as something that was plausible, although clearly it was possible because it happened, right? And so there's this really weird kind of interaction at that juncture. Like most people tend to focus on like shifting from the probable to the preferable, like shifting. But actually, one of the really interesting things to think through as a designer, as someone who's interested in how the world works, is the relationship between plausible and possible. How do we modulate that, right? And one of the things I'll say, just kind of again, as a phenomenologist, is I have the belief that that reality is inexhaustible. In other words, what is possible is nearly inexhaustible, right? So you can't actually conceive of or approach truly possible understanding, a true understanding of the complete possibility, the total possibility of the world. So plausible is always kind of like preferable, in that preferable is a selection. What's plausible is a selection of what's possible, or so what's possible. So how do we make those decisions? And one of the answers might be things like I was talking about earlier. What you imagine to be plausible is defined by your worldview, managerialism, mathematism, scientism, things like this. And that defines what's plausible in relationship to this kind of inexhaustible possibility. And so that is one way of kind of conceiving of the future and how the future could be imagined. Now, if we want to relate that idea to, there's two tricks we have to play at the same time. So we'll play one trick and then we'll play the other trick. The first trick is to imagine that you don't have the only flashlight in the world, that there's all sorts of other people who have flashlights, and they're all pointing at different parts of the possible, and that is defining what their plausible is. And it's also a loop, because what they imagine to be plausible is defining what they believe to be preferable. So there's this weird looping that's happening. It's not just that they've selected something and looked at it. It's that the way that they've looked at the possible is self-reinforcing their belief of what is preferable. Yeah. So there's this loop. And then the other thing that ends up happening, and the way that I kind of talked about earlier, was like, one of the beauties of science and mathematics is its reproducibility. And I don't mean it by like, you could make the numbers work again. What I do mean is that, like, there's lots of things that you and I can talk about, but if you go like, how do you know that's true? How do you know that that's right? With math and science, one of the beauties of it is I can say, okay, Ben, I can prove that I'm right, because you run this experiment, you should get the same result I got. And so I like to call it like a checksum idea. Like, science is basically the production of a bunch of checksums. So like, you want to believe I'm true, here's the checksum. Here's the answer you'll get if you run this problem. So you run the problem yourself, you'll get the same answer. Now you know that I was telling the truth, right? That means that kind of sense or understanding of what is plausible actually is very we'll go with the disease theme, infectious. It spreads easily. It spreads easier, yeah, because it allows people to kind of have a negotiation about consensus that is quickly closed off. Now, of course, there's a huge amount of politics right now that is basically driven by a pushback against that, of the ability of science to do that, to create consensus. I mean, just look at people protesting right now about opening the economy back up, or who want to specifically argue that it doesn't matter what science says, or they don't believe what science says, right? So blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so there's a whole chain there. Now, that means that you have what we could call pluralistic futures, and pluralistic futures is people pointing their flashlights in different places. And one of the ways to think about eliminating futures is to say that certain people don't have the right to point their flashlights in that direction anymore. They have to point the flashlight into the same place, and that they're either crazy or illogical or not sane, or all these other kind of irrational, all these other kind of ways you want to talk about other forms of thinking, other forms of existing, other forms of truth. And therefore, what they need to do is be corrected to point their flashlight in the same direction everybody else is pointing their flashlight. And so that, what you should be imagining is the cone of light, literally the enlightenment cone, is shrinking, because people are now pointing all their flashlights in the same direction, aligned in the same way. And that eliminates futures. It eliminates people imagining that they should continue to exist in certain ways in the world in the future. Yeah? One way is to say that is like colonization of the future. Now that's one way of saying it. The other way of saying it is like kind of like, how do you increase, like this is a classic example, like how do you increase the width of the beam? And I am not a fan of this. I do think that human beings are constrained in what they can imagine. I don't mean by that human beings are constrained by what they can imagine is plausible, but what the relationship between the plausible and the possible. So in other words, again, you can't have a total understanding of the possible, therefore you must make a selection of what you believe is plausible, right? That's what I mean by, that doesn't mean you can't point the plausibility all over the place. Yeah, you can point the plausibility all sorts of places, which means that there's a richness to what is plausible that gets eliminated when we kind of try to point it all in the same direction. So that's the difference between kind of like pluralism and expansive plausibility. Those are two different ways of kind of thinking through that. And then the last one is this. The last one is much more of a temporal way of thinking about the future. All of these kind of fall under a theory of what's called defuturing. And defuturing is the idea that when you select a future, you have to eliminate other futures in order to make that future true. You have to make commitments to things, right? So one of the kind of ways that we talk about this in the Agile community is like options theory and commitment theory, right? Like when you commit to a certain future, you eliminate other futures. That's what a commitment does. It eliminates other options. Yeah. The one way to think about this defuturing, the last way, is this temporal way, and roughly what it is this. You can imagine an economy, it's called a circular economy, and you can imagine this economy where we design everything to be perfectly recyclable. So it always recreates itself in kind of these perfectly understood cycles. Yeah. Now, I'm just saying you can imagine that. I'm not saying that you could actually make it happen. And there's lots of reasons why that may not be possible, but you can imagine that it would be a goal, that it would be a plausible goal, that what you want to achieve is a system with as little waste as possible. And so that every time you make something, the waste that's created is a value add input to some other process in the system, so that all of the system becomes efficient and consistently reuses the material inputs, right? And so part of the idea behind this in environmental theory is that it's a form of dematerialization. It basically argues that we could, if we had a better system where basically recycling was perfect and had low energy costs, then we wouldn't have to mine so much more ore. We could stop removing material from the planet and just start reusing material from the planet, right? So it's what's called circular economy. But you can also imagine that if that were true, then all you would be doing is continuously reproducing the current material conditions. Yeah. In other words, there would be no future. The future would not exist anymore because you would just simply be reproducing the current material state. So people wouldn't be kind of able to create new experiences, new things in the world, because in order to do that, they would have to figure out how to fit it into these circular systems. Yeah. And really the kind of philosophical version of that is that, like, the idea of an open future, the idea of that cone opening up into the future, really only came about around the French Revolution. I'm not saying the cone in particular, but the idea of having an open future is something that came about during the French Revolution, because prior to the French Revolution, what a revolution meant was to revolve back to a state of stability, having gone out of stability. So the revolution was kind of a completion of the cycle. That's why you revolve, right? And it wasn't a revolution like to overthrow the current system and move forward into an open future. It was to set the system stable again, return to a stable state. Yeah. So all these ideas have to do with kind of like the way in which the future is either open or not, colonized or not, defutured or not, and in particular this kind of defuturing that has to do with an arrogant belief that we can imagine the all possible needs in the future, and that we could design a system to satisfy all of those future needs. And in particular, just one last ranty bit here, the reason why that has to be false is because what humans want, or one of the primary experiences of humans, one of the things that humans value, one of the things that is innate to human being, is the creation of novel experiences. And if we create systems that do not allow for the future to be open in that it's not already colonized by pre-thought out experiences, we end up dehumanizing the future. We create a system, a future in which people do not have an authentic human experience. So we need to have this weird conversation where we have to balance out not trying to create a system that simply recreates itself, while also understanding that we can't, that the future is not continuously getting opener. It doesn't, like, there's not an infinite amount of possibility that we can approach, because every possibility has an energy cost, right? So there's a limit to what we can do, and then but that limit cannot be managed by a set of rules. It has to be kind of managed by a set of heuristics, I guess. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, but that was roughly what I was thinking about.
So it's almost as if between what Mark said and what you said, Jabe, I'm going to step into the role of kind of like a naive,
Yep.
Like, let me tell you what I heard.
Yep.
And I think there's maybe a really like interesting critique to be had, that maybe, Mark, maybe you can start to draw the lines so that we can start coloring within them, of that critique. So the really naive version of this is Mark says, fuck the earth, let's go to space. And Jabe says, fuck recycling, let's do something else. What is it about me pointing at those things that is missing the point, so that maybe we could get closer to the point? And Mark, I'm kind of curious what you think here.
So it's also very, I love, Jabe, how you said everybody's putting the flashlight on the same spot. And that spot is, how do we get back to where we were, before this? Everybody's pressing government say, when are we, what's your plan to go back to normal, yeah? But if you listen to the experts, and they're now quite a lot of them quite accessible, because thankfully sufficient people started no longer being happy with, this is going to be a 3-week or a 6-week or a 3-month thing, and they really want to get on and say, here's the incoherence in that argument. They will start looking for voices that are more coherent. So we start to hear this. So a very realistic scenario is, even if we want to open up things again, we will do so in a very controlled way. And it's an opening, closing, opening, closing. So right now, most Western countries at least, at best 10% got infected. Yeah, so when you're opening up, there's 90% people still fully susceptible to the virus. So how much can you open up? As soon as you start opening up too much, you're going to have exactly the same problem that we're faced with now. Too many people ill, you exhaust the health system, so people die unnecessarily. And all the figures that we constantly see, we start to just hear, okay, we haven't heard what happened outside of hospitals. We make guesses and they seem to be wrong. And we even less hear about what other causes are people dying for, because they can't get their cancer treatment, all of that. So the interesting thing is, people constantly say, how do we get back to normal? And I was looking for people who left, and, so all the usual cases, and nobody's articulating actually how this could be an opportunity to leverage us to something better. And as I said, right now, the reason the oil regime has bitten back is because we're using substantially less oil, and that's a good thing. Almost anybody's playbook, even mine with space. I'm thinking we're accelerating the destruction of this planet to the extent that we're not going to be able to learn quickly enough to get off this planet. And whose paradox is it again, that we can't see any, that we've got any signs from intelligent light out there, because hardly anybody actually makes it through this space. So I think the trajectory is still actually quite dire. And even though I see this other one, I don't actually see us being successful at it. So if we want to start articulating better futures, so the first thing is actually we have to accept what has just happened. And as I said, just because we knew, probably even before the 80s was when I first read about this, that these kind of things can happen. There's plenty of other scenarios, by the way, where civilization could be severely disrupted. So more mundane things, like there's a supervolcano under your continent, North America, that's, as far as I know, is several thousand years due to explode. And meteors, all sorts of things can destabilize, could have destabilized the way we're living. So what we should be asking ourselves is, we've taken a lot of stability for granted. And I think that's partially how we sort of slid into this destructive, or as I see it, just very consumerist attitude towards the world in which we live and of which we're part. somebody said this might have been just bad enough for us to wake up, and not bad enough to remove the chance of us actually recovering and learning from it. And so I think that's sort of where we should go to. You were talking about option theory, and it was very interesting. Chris Matz, who's articulated options theory for us, has actually said, what can we do to start creating options that take what has happened into a direction that actually makes sense and that shows a life forward? So one of the things he's suggesting is, let's go and write up stories. Imagine just what you think maybe society could look like 2-3 years in the future, and do a future backwards and write the story of your future backwards. So I think he has written one. I'm sorry, Chris, that I now let the cat out of the bag. I'm busy writing one, but you can also hear it in normal conversations, people actually doing this. So this was the surprising thing for me at work. So at work, we did this little session where we brought people from a larger part of the organization together and asked them questions of how you're coping. What are you noticing in the new way of living? What's good about it? What's bad about it? What would you miss if we would go back? What do you notice in your environment that you now like better? And in the discussion, actually most people, or many people at least, expressed, well, I do not want to go back to normal. Right now, might be an extreme form of how the future might look like, but hey, not having to commute every day into the office, really cool. Also, when I'm not in a meeting, I'm in my environment. I can go, I have the kitchen, I have my garden, I have family. I can recharge my batteries much more quickly than in an office space. So people actually start to see qualities in the change. And there's an interesting thing that happens to us in our habits and behaviors roughly around the 3-month mark, yeah, where we suddenly start to accept the new as the normal. And then, so given that it's most likely that we will be in a very controlled lockdown beyond 3 months, actually getting people to come back to the office might be hard. And you might actually have to have an argument like, you know, you need to use these machines that you bake for your flat, or that sort of thing might be still the reason you need to get out. But a lot of knowledge workers they're now learning how to work from home. And a lot of them will say, well, that's how I want to work. And we can see this already in the tech community. There's already a ton of developers that have practiced this now for years and they have sung the praises of this way of working for a long time. So we need to start looking at futures that we can build from where we are, where this, in hindsight, will become will be seen as a catalyst, not this big disaster that just threw us back economically, I don't know what, to the 30s.
Yeah, and what I sort of the critique on the recycling bit was, to me, the back to normal part of this, right? The very timid, almost missing the point of the opportunity. And I hesitate to call this moment an opportunity because I don't want to ignore the immense suffering and the immense suffering and pain that occurs as a result of this thing unfolding, right? And the severe lack of confidence that I have that people will care for other humans, let alone care for the world. And again, I'm separating those things as they can be separated, but I'm not seeing demonstration of any of that, of any flavor, in a way that is consistent and persistent. So thinking about not being too timid and not being escapist and just saying, let's go to the moon or whatever, or Mars. What now?
Yeah.
Just one thing, Jay.
Yep.
I think actually the fact that there is so much suffering creates a moral obligation that we do something better, that we learn something, that we are improving something as a consequence of this. Going back would literally mean we're not learned and all the suffering was for naught. And if that's the perspective, then yes, we should go after certain leaders in this world as much course as we can for having actually all of them chosen to go down the path of change. So if you think about it, whatever their motivations, Boris and Trump and blah, 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 is, they did not consider how to go back to normal. That's not how they strategize. They strategize, how can we make this an opportunity? Now, they have their motivations and how they want to profit from the opportunity. We need to have some voice, some sort of vision that we can hold up against it and that people can rally behind. And Jay will tell us how.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, you know what? I want to. I like the first thing I'll say is, like, I love the idea of writing futures, and I think that's great. But the way to prevent the colonization of the future that I was describing is to say, you know, don't become overly attached to your futures. The point of future backwards is to say what's the next thing, not what's the final thing. If that makes any sense. And the final thing becomes like an attractor, a way of kind of generating focus around movement. It doesn't become the goal. It becomes a, you know, way of talking about why we're acting. Yeah. And it's different. Like, it's different than a goal, because a goal needs to be achieved. And that's not the point, I think, of kind of future backwards. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea of kind of recycling and oil and what the COVID crisis is revealing about kind of how humans think about the world, or what humans can think about the world, maybe. So there's a guy named Timothy Morton, and Timothy Morton has this idea. He's called hyper objects. And what a hyper object is roughly to say, like, okay, so Jabe started describing this idea of a world, which is a system, which is things around Jabe. And Jabe collects things and puts them in order and cares for them and takes care of them and maintains them in a way that makes his world more meaningful to him, so that he can be concerned about it, blah, blah, blah. That generally makes sense to everybody so far. So a hyperobject is just to say, the weird thing about Jabe's car that he cares for and has concern for and blah, 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 and is part of his world, is that, like, there's gas that goes in and rubber and all these other things that are nowhere near Jabe. They're actually quite far from Jabe. They originate all over the place. And then there's all these other systems that contribute to the oil getting to Jabe. And like, so actually, if we want to think of Jabe as a kind of holism, as a system of things, those things are like huge, like literally, for Morton, literally unimaginably large. In other words, Jabe can't understand the system that he is. He is such a big system that he can't understand what the hell is happening. Yeah, he can't understand how his way of being in the world is affecting the world, because it's too big. The system is too large. Yeah, and I like to think of this in a weird way, and the oil is a useful way of thinking of this. Because it points out how this works in a way. The way this generally works right now is that there's two different kind of regimes in the world. I call them the regime of production and the regime of consumption, right? So the one that most people are aware of is the regime of consumption. It's the things that they consume, like the food and devices and objects that they are aware of in their immediate area. And they're kind of intimately involved with them. They can even care about them in a way, like they can care about their phone. My dog's over here on the chair. If you guys patting your cats. Anyway, so the point being, like, you can care for things, although there's this weird argument that goes like, well, one of the interesting things about things like iPhones is that they have low kind of emotional, what's called emotional durability. They like, the weird thing is that, like, you really actually do care about your phone until it's destroyed, and then you go get a new one, and then you replace all the stuff on it, and then like 5-10 minutes later, you don't actually care about that physical object, right? You care about the things in the physical object, and you care about the existence of the physical object, but you don't care about that particular physical object. Anyway, so the point being, there's these things that are close to you that you consume, right? And then there's markets and systems that are built around creating or satiating those needs, and also frankly creating those needs, right? So creating the need and satiating the need of a consumer, right? Now, the really interesting thing that's happening in the shutdown is that the thing that first got shut down was the market of consumption, mostly, right? The regimes of consumption, anything other than non-essential versions. In other words, one of the kind of instructive moments for people right now is to realize, like, what are authentic needs and what are artificial needs. The authentic needs are literally, I need food, water, shelter. These are things that I actually do absolutely need. And those parts of the system can't be turned off. On the other hand, things like I need a new computer, I need new toys, I need like all sorts of other stuff. Frankly, like Amazon's really instructive of this too. If you go to Amazon right now and you try to buy almost anything, they will give you a little thing that says, this is a non-essential item. Therefore, we will ship it to you in 4 weeks. All those things are not satisfying true needs. They're satisfying artificial needs. And it's a very instructive moment to like go and look at that, right? So anyway, that's all critique of kind of consumerism and the interesting thing about consumerism. But the thing about consumerism and the consumerist regimes is that they are supported by production regimes. And production regimes are regimes that produce the things that the objects in the consumer regime consume themselves. So that's a very long way of saying, like, electricity and oil are not consumed by consumers. They're consumed by the consumer's devices. Yeah. So your computer consumes electricity. You don't consume electricity. Your car consumes gas. You don't consume gas. And therefore, there's this really weird relationship you have with those things. You care about the price of them to an extent, but you actually really don't know anything about the quality of them. Like, there are audiophiles out there in the world who understand the quality of the waveform of the electricity that's coming into their house. Most of us have no clue that there's any variability in the waveforms at all. We just use it. There are people out there who care about the quality of the gasoline that they're putting in their car, but 99% of the planet couldn't tell you what octane is and why you would want more or less of it in your car. Yeah. So the point of that being that all of the regimes that produce these things, gasoline, like true commodity level utility infrastructure pieces, people don't understand them, they don't observe them, and they don't actually interact with them. And the result of that is twofold. One is that the way that gasoline and electricity get to be those regimes of production is because so many things, so many objects in the consumer regime use them. Because you can't get to a regime of production until you get to a highly scaled system. Because that is one of the things that happens, right? Like, as you scale up the number of objects that can use gasoline or electricity or any of the other kind of ideas from that regime, you basically actually end up stabilizing the production of that utility, right? In other words, there's so many trucks and cars and trains and planes and blah, 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 all consuming gasoline that the people who are producing the gasoline are the primary service, the primary quality that they're producing is generic energy for a specific price point. That specific price point for that unit of energy is what makes the consumer regime stable. Because if the fluctuation in the pricing of the gasoline or the electricity was very variable, the consumerist regime on top of it couldn't actually produce regularity. It would also have to have lots of fluctuation in it, right? In other words, like, the cost of your computer would go from being like $10 one day to $1,000 the next day, and nobody would know when to buy computers, so they wouldn't, right? Or nobody would know when they could run their computers because it would be too unstable. Now, the really interesting thing that's happening right now that kind of shows the way that this kind of hyper object, right, the way in which you, your car, gasoline, blah, 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 are interacting across these two regimes is that we shut down the consumer regime, but the production regimes, just as Mark pointed out, couldn't be shut down as easily. And the reason is because production regimes do not respond directly to market stimuli. Consumer regimes respond reasonably to market consumption, but production systems don't actually respond well to market concerns. And the opposite can be seen in electricity, by the way. If you look at electricity, one of the biggest problems most electricity companies have is overconsumption of electricity during summer. And they almost literally cannot convince people to pay enough attention to it to stop overloading the grid during the summer. Right? They send you all sorts of warnings. They tell you the price is going to go up. There's all sorts of experiments about like putting objects in people's rooms, in people's houses that will light up and tell them how much electricity they're consuming. They will send out news broadcasts. There's going to be a brownout next week if you people don't stop using the electricity you don't need to use right now. Please shift your electrical use, like your electric stove use, to nighttime. Don't do it during the day. All these types of things, right? So again, these regimes of production don't respond well to market fluctuation. Yeah. So the result of this is kind of trying to point out something, which is people don't think well at scale about the world. They don't think well about production regimes. They don't think well, and those are the regimes, the production regimes are the regimes that, everybody likes to point towards the consumerist regimes as being the cause of the environmental crisis. But clearly, it's actually a relationship between production regimes and consumerist regimes that is actually causing the crisis. And as much damage is being done by the production of oil and electricity as by the consumption of it by these objects, right? So we have this inability to even grapple with the concept that we're trying to deal with, right? And this concept of the hyperobject, or the concept of these hyperscaled systems, right? And I think the last version of that we can kind of see is problematic right now in the COVID crisis is the way in which we cannot conceive of society as a large hyperobject itself. People have an incredibly difficult time thinking about the fact that the reason why people are social isolating is not because of the threat to any one individual, but because of a threat to the system. It's a social level problem that actually doesn't really affect individuals, right? And what I mean by this is kind of specific, right? Like any of us, if any of the three of us on this phone got COVID tomorrow, we would all have, I don't know, because of our various health conditions, maybe somewhere between 6% chance and 2% chance or 1% chance of death. Yeah. So 6% is pretty high, right? So maybe I'm being overly pessimistic, but it's still an incredibly low percentage of us would die, right? And like if you had cancer right now and your doctor came to you and said you have a 98% survival rate, you'd be like, yeah, I'm going to kick cancer's ass. The thing about cancer, though, is that it's not, infectious. So the problem isn't actually an individual problem. It's not whether you will get sick. It's whether or not you will make many other people sick. And people have a very, very, very difficult time understanding this. They don't have a way of conceiving it well because of the nature of our economic systems and the way that we explain rationality. We talk so much about individuals that when you say to somebody, this isn't an individual's problem, it is a social problem. It doesn't have to do anything with you as an individual. It has to do with us as a society. People almost immediately have an incredibly difficult time literally understanding what you're saying. And all the people who are out there, protesting right now, and by the way, I actually don't think there's a lot of them. I think it's a big overblown thing. But the people who are out there who are protesting about this and are complaining about, the amount of people who are dying is low, blah, blah, blah. The answer is, here's my question. If we all agree that between 1% and 2% of people die, is anybody disagreeing about that? No. Okay. All right. So which would you rather have? 1% of $1 or 1% of $1 million? Okay, you do understand that the scale of the problem significantly affects the quality of the answer. Then you do understand that you would rather have 1% of a million. Well, all we're saying is the inverse of that, right? It's not about the percentage of the $1. It's about the percentage of the $1 million, and the difference between those two is significant, right? So anyway, I think that's part of like the constraint that I want to point at is that, Morton and some other people want people to have a better understanding of hyper objects. And one of the things that I think is roughly this. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most human beings would not have traveled, well, I'm going to guess, I'm sure there's an exact number, let's say 50 miles from the site of birth. Yeah. And that means that almost everything that they would have consumed in their life, the hyper object that they were, would have realistically been, let's say, maybe twice that size. So like maybe they consumed something that touched a system that got up to maybe 100 or 200 miles away. But most of what they were consuming, their hyper objectivity was actually quite local, right? And there's multiple versions of that. Like one of the things is that the plurality of the systems were easier to deal with then because the systems were in pockets. They didn't touch each other directly. They didn't interact with each other as homogeneously as we do right now, where globalism tries to make everyone look the same because it's so easy to travel from place to place. Back then, if the people in California lived different than the people in New York, 90% of the people in New York would have no clue what that difference was because they would have never seen it. They would have never experienced it. Right? So the point being, we really need to understand to some extent that our futures, if we're going to accept this constraint, if we're going to accept that humans are probably not going to suddenly have a light bulb moment and understand their hyperobjectivity, is probably significantly less global, A, and B, that if there's two versions of deglobalizing the future, and one of them is nationalism, which is what we see with Trump and some of these other people, and the other is something not quite well imagined yet, yeah? Something that values localism, but also values global journeys, the ability to move across the globe, that there is value in having more local control, but there's also value in being able to move through localities and have different experiences. Like we need to go through, as I really liked Mark's, versions of this. We can't go back. We got to go through. The point is not to go back to like localism like it was practiced prior to the Industrial Revolution, because we can't fucking get there. We have to go through, but we have to arrive on the other side of this with a world that we can care for in the way that we can understand the systemic relationships that we have with that world. And those systemic relationships are probably not effectively managed via managerialism as a way of being. So that's my rant for that.
So it's funny that you said almost right at the end there that we have to go through, not back, as a nod to what Mark was saying. What's funny about that is when you were first describing the hyperobject of society and the kind of separation, or like the entangledness, but absolute scale of systems of consumption, systems of production, all this kind of stuff, that my immediate reaction to this was, oh, okay, so it's simple then. In order to care for the world, I just have to isolate myself from the world, as like we're talking about it now. So I just have to go get a log cabin, and I have to hunt, and I have to fish, and I have to live all by myself, and that's the answer. Ta-da!
That was Heidegger's answer.
That's another way of backwards.
Exactly. So Mark, to kind of close us out, we can't go backwards. What does it mean to go through?
Okay, I'll try to not be too long. So I like what I'm going to ping back to maybe just quickly on the Chris Matz thing and doing the future backwards. You do it exactly to create options for a next adjacent. So of course, so one of the things that Chris says or explained when he encouraged people to start writing these stories is you don't need to worry about how realistic your far future 2-3 year out vision is. When you work backwards, what we're really interested in is, can you come up with a step we can take from here? So absolutely, that is the point of running a future backwards in the cognitive edge sense, is to surface options for a step from here that we wouldn't see if we wouldn't actually come from that direction of the future. If we're just looking at what we already know, we'll miss this. We have to be a bit crazy about the future. So Dave Snowden says, imagine heaven, yeah? Super idealistic and work backwards. And it's that idealism that might surface close to where we are, something we wouldn't otherwise see. And so the electricity regime is an interesting thing, as Jabe explains in the summer, the companies. So it must be a slightly more American phenomenon because I've never got any leaflets in the summer. I wasn't supposed to do consumption, but you have air conditioning, which we don't. It's not less popular in the UK. Well, it never gets quite as hot as it gets in the States. So that might have something to do with it. But I can't recall the source now at the top of my head. And yes, I took the cat on my lap because she was crying. And if I wanted to start to talk, you'd have heard the cat crying more than me. But
I like your puppy, Jabe.
But there is a study that I've heard about that tried to understand why do these electricity meters that tell you could be green or why do they don't work? And essentially, so this is a design thing, is they induce guilt, yeah? They essentially say, if you're not in the green, you've been a bad person. And very surprisingly, we do not respond well to that kind of motivation. But a much more positive thing is some of these browsers that said, if you use us, we're planting trees, yeah? And you get little indicators and suddenly say, hey, because I've now used this browser instead of Google, suddenly look at all the trees. So it's a positive indicator and it incentivizes. So if we want to go about finding options, then that has to be a key thing. It's not about blame. It's about making you feel good about doing things slightly differently in a positive way.
Almost like
I think
you care for the world.
Sorry?
Almost like you'd be rewarded for caring for the world.
Yeah.
Almost.
And for yourself as well, because
yeah,
you need a relatively healthy world to survive. There's also the thing that has come out now in the responses that you see globally to COVID-19. So we often say, oh yeah, so China did well, or some of these countries did better. Do you want communism, totalitarianism? Is that? But what people often ignore when they talk about China or Asian societies is that they have far more collectivist philosophies and cultures, that they think more holistically about themselves as part of a bigger group, where we in the West, I can't put my finger on when it kicked off, but certainly in the last 100 years or so, have increasingly promoted dog-eat-dog kind of mentality. So the American dream is in itself a perfect dog-eat-dog mentality because everybody who buys into it accepts it's not possible for everybody, not even for most, yeah? And sort of by accepting it, they also would accept, well, if I didn't make it, then I am probably an inferior human and deserve it. Both of these notions, as far as I understand Asian cultures, are pretty alien to them, yeah? And so their collectivist reaction is something that is culturally different from the West. But it might point at how we need to change our thinking. And I wouldn't say go completely collectivist. I think it is we have to find sort of come together, compromise, which also sometimes can be experienced if you have working groups where you have a mix of Western and Asian people discussing some principles. You sometimes realize that it's in the mix where suddenly novelty arises. It's not either or, it's something new. I assume anybody who's listened to this doesn't need to be sold on diversity, etc., but that is clearly a key ingredient. I would also quickly point out that the fact why nationalism is so much easier to articulate is because it's still backward. It piggybacks on things that existed and have still cultural hooks around that they sort of can reactivate. And it is harder to articulate the forward thing, hence, yeah. But maybe where we need to get people to is that they start embarking on the future without somebody having this comprehensive and coherent vision of, you know, the future north.
Yep.
Because even if there was one, we should be scared of it, yeah? Because nobody can anticipate what happens once we took the first step.
Yep.
So we have to, and okay, this might be now again Western privilege speaking, but again, when we had this discussion with people in the company I'm working in, this is not a negative thing entirely, yeah? People try to see the positive, they don't need a complete answer. What they want to know is, so how are you going to, so here are some of the decisions that you probably need to make soon. How are we making these decisions? That's the question that we're asking. So when we go to the politicians, we shouldn't go and ask and say, how do you open up the economy again? The question is, so we're now stabilizing sort of the health regime to an extent that the health system can cope with the influx of infected people. How can we stabilize that? And so if you go and listen by the experts, one of the things that will come about is that you probably have to have very local pockets. And I've read numbers around, so you will have local health regimes, health boards that will make the decision who, right now we have so if you have an outbreak, yeah, and assuming we have the tracing capability so we know where the outbreak is, as soon as you have an outbreak, you will lock that down. But if the granularity is roughly what I heard, about 2,500 people, yeah, you can literally do this. Okay, sorry, you guys, you have an outbreak for the next 2 weeks, you all stay home, but it only going to impact 2,500 people.
Yep.
So then suddenly we will start to have a political regime where our hyper-objectivity might be limited to that 2,500 people area. So here is a way how we might make this positive, that we might have to look at ways, which parts, at least, let's start making some parts of our economic dependency local again, so they can be satisfied within a 2,500 people area.
Yep. That would be cool.
Yeah, the governance of the health boards. They're going to take over. They're going to decide what we can do, what we're not going to do. That, from what I've read this or heard, this now starts to become a likely scenario. And it will take some time, and so they will not be immediately super powerful. But if they have the ability to just say, people in this district now have to stay home for 14 days, that has huge consequences how society will change.
So not global, not extremely local in the sense of going backwards.
Totally self-sufficiency, but self-sufficiency amongst a smaller group of people. And so that will also help with carbon footprint and all of the other things.
Through.
Forward.
Yeah. So like a lot of like the previous constraints could be reconceived right now, you know? A lot of them. A lot of the ideas about like how will we pay for our rent? How about like we don't pay for rent until we get this under control? Like what
Universal basic income suddenly becomes, even by capitalists, tolerated or wanted.
How could we possibly pay for it? How about we don't pay for the military for 6 months?
Or how about we don't care for now how we pay for it?
Right, yeah.
We'll care about how we are staying healthy and continue not using transport so much. Shit like that.
But I mean, you know, this is a very distinct moment, right, in this kind of conception. And there's this conception that really says, you know, I will try to say I'm not trying to be pro-communist or pro-socialist, but I am trying to be anti-capitalist. It is easier to imagine the end of the world, than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And in this particular case, and that idea comes from an idea called capitalist realism, where it basically says that capitalism is the best description of realism, of reality, and therefore there's no way to escape it. And really, one of the things we're experiencing right now with these, with the way that Trump originally reacted, with theories like just get to herd immunity that you heard in the UK, and now with the open the economy back up, it's not even capitalist realism; it's capitalist fatalism. It's the idea that we should die for capitalism, and that is something we should get through and beyond. And we need to. One of the ways we know that we will have imagined a new way of being in the world is when the mathematical nature of capitalism is not seen as the only way of having an authentic, true existence in the world, and therefore not everyone needs to participate in that system anymore. Some people might continue to, but not everyone needs to.
Thank you both for sharing your thoughts on this, and I'm really excited to share this with the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.